written a poem for a woman who rides a bus in New York City. She's a maid. She has 2 shopping bags. When the bus stops abruptly, she laughs. If the bus stops slowly, she laughs. If the bus picks up someone, she laughs. If the bus misses someone, she... So I watched her for about 9 months. I thought, Now, if you don't know black features, you may think she's laughing. But she wasn't laughing. She was simply extending her lips and making a sound. I said, oh, I see. That's that survival apparatus. Now, let me write about that to honor this woman who helps us to survive. By her very survival, Miss Rosie, through your destruction I stand up. So I used the poem with Mr. Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Masks, and my own poem for old black men. Mr. Dunbar wrote Masks in 1892. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It shades our cheeks and hides our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding heart, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs, and they let them only see us while we wear the mask? We smile, but oh my God, our tears to thee from tortured souls arise, and we sing, hey baby bye, we sing, hey, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world think otherwise. We wear the mask. When I think about myself, I almost laugh myself to death. My life has been one great big joke, a dance that's walked, a song was spoke. I laugh so hard, I almost choke when I think about myself. 70 years in these folks' world. The child I works for calls me girl. I say, yes, ma'am, for working's sake. I'm too proud to bend and too poor to break. So I laugh until my stomach ache when I think about myself. My folks can make me split my side. I laugh so hard, I nearly died. The tales they tell sound just like lying. They grow the fruit, but eat the rind. I laugh until I start to cry when I think about myself and my folks and the little children. My fathers sit on benches. Their flesh count every plank. The slats leave dents of darkness deep in their withered flank, and they nod like broken candles, all waxed and burnt profound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission that made your world go round. There in those pleated faces I see the auction block, the chains and slavery's coffles, the whip and lash and stock. My father's speaking voices that shred my fact and sound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission, and that made your world go round. They laughed to shield their crying. They shuffled through their dreams. They stepped and fetched a country and wrote the blues in screams. I understand their meaning. It could and did derive from living on the ledge of death. They kept my race alive by wearing the mask.
Hello and welcome to Baha'i Chat. I just want to acknowledge that that was a really powerful poem and performance by Maya Angelou, particularly during these times. We've come together today for a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. Baha'i Chat is an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas, and today especially, practical action based on spiritual ideas. Each session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of humankind, led by individuals who are putting these principles into action. This is our third in a series focused on racial justice. I'm Layli Mapayan, standing in today for David Hoffman as co-host, and today's program focuses on participation in transformative social change. What capabilities, qualities, attitudes, abilities, and skills enable our meaningful participation in social transformation? The notion of participation that we will explore today goes beyond looking at our own role in such processes and asks us to consider how we see the role of people who are different from us in countless ways. Can we imagine universal participation in social transformation? What might that look like? As we shared during the last program in this racial justice series, the Universal House of Justice, the highest governing body of the global Baha'i community, informs us that we are in a moment of great possibility to, quote, create a consequential reform of the social order that will free it from the pernicious effects of racial prejudice and will hasten the attainment of a just, diverse, and united society that can increasingly manifest the oneness of the human family, unquote. It is toward such an end that today's conversation is directed. I'm delighted to introduce today's guests, all of whom exemplify racial justice work that is animated by conscious awareness of the oneness of humankind, as well as my co-curator of this racial justice series, Masood Olafani, who will facilitate today's conversation. Masood is an Atlanta-based multidisciplinary artist, actor, and writer who also produces a racial justice-themed podcast, America's Most Challenging Issue, for BahaiTeachings.org. Today, we've invited two of our friends from the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'is of the United States, also known as OPA. PJ Andrews and May Lample are both race discourse officers with OPA, and they've invited two of their friends and collaborators from the wider community, Laura Horwitz and Matt Burkhold. Both May and PJ will say a bit more about their work with OPA in a few minutes, but you might like to know that prior to joining OPA, PJ worked in ethical culture development for the Service Employees International Union, in government relations for national service programs with the Corporation for National and Community Service, as a case manager for U.S. Congressman Chris Van Hollen, and supported the work of the International Teaching Center at the World Center of the Baha'i Faith in Haifa, Israel. Prior to joining OPA, May worked in health education and community mobilization for Southeastern Health, in maternal health research for Kimanya Ngeo in Uganda, and in global discourse on the equality of women and men for the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity in Israel. Laura Horwitz is a change maker and community leader based in St. Louis. She co-founded and served as the executive director of We Stories, which helps white families start and strengthen conversations about racism and become effective advocates for racial justice. Since leaving We Stories in January 2020, Laura has been instrumental in forming a local mutual aid and financial solidarity network in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and has been offering training workshops and consulting services to a variety of organizations. Laura is a member of SADC Lab, a national multiracial network of political education trainers, organizers, spiritual leaders, and cultural workers, Jews and allies, established to build collective competency to better politicize, transform, and inspire the Jewish community into collective action against racism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. Matt Burkhold is founder of Visionary Organizing Lab and takes seriously his responsibility for contributing to transforming the world around him. After almost 2 decades of participating in social movements, he thinks of his work as organizing around people's desire to become more fully human. He lives in Washington, D.C. Today's program will be a conversation until around 3:15, followed by a 5-minute break, then a 30-minute question and answer session, during which time we'll be pulling from the Q&A box on Zoom. If, after today's program, you'd like more information about the Baha'i Faith, email info@baha'i.chat and write guide in the subject line, or visit baha'i.org. So take it away, Masood.
Well, I am so happy to be here again, to be with you, Layli, and with our distinguished panel of guests, man. This is exciting. This is either going to be really good or a hot mess because we got so many people in this participation. So this, this is the largest panel that we've had up to date. So I am just really happy to see you guys and look forward to learning, man, and participating and just hearing the wisdom and the learnings that you picked up along the way and the really valuable work that you do. I thought a good place to start really would be to just start with PJ and May and hear a little bit about what you do at the Office of Public Affairs at Baha'i National Center, and then also how you came to know Matt and Laura and what really got you interested in the work that they do. So if you could comment on that, I'd love to hear that.
Sure. I'd be happy to start, and then PJ, if I miss anything, you can complete the picture. But a little bit about our office. So our office is an agency of the governing body of the American Baha'i community, which is called the National Spiritual Assembly. So we're tasked with representing the American Baha'i community at the national level. And we engage primarily with the government, non-governmental organizations, and with the media. And our office is concerned primarily with engaging at the level of discourse. So we are really thinking about how we can share Baha'i principles and also, when appropriate, the accumulated experience, applying those principles at the national level. So we're thinking specifically about areas of discourse that have a bearing on the well-being of the country. So our office focuses on a few areas of discourse, a few being the environment, the equality of women and men, economic justice, human rights, media, and then PJ and I specifically are thinking about the discourse around racial justice and unity. And so as Baha'is, we have an understanding that, you know, the changes that we want in the world won't only be accomplished by Baha'is. They require, you know, all individuals and groups contributing to the advancement of their community. And so we really, at the Office of Public Affairs, have an opportunity to work alongside other people who are really thinking about pursuing knowledge and social progress and thinking about the transformation of the community. So as part of our work, we have the opportunity to build relationships with a variety of actors and organizations and be in different social spaces where conversations like this are taking place. And so, and then we also try to create maybe some of our own environments, some of our own spaces, and then also develop content that we use in these spaces. So it was actually, you know, we met Laura and Matt through some of these spaces. So Matt, we were fortunate to meet we were in Detroit attending a conference, Facing Race conference, and he was there doing a training with the Bog Center, who he's been involved with. And we met at a dinner through mutual friends. And then Laura and PJ actually go back a ways. They went to college together, I think undergrad, and they had very similar interests. And then this work that PJ and I are doing, we've been doing for the last almost 3 years, really brought Laura and PJ's interests back in line with each other. And I don't want to tell their story, so I'll let them share a little bit more about that. But just to say a little bit about the theme of what we wanted to talk about today, the reason why we wanted to talk about participation is because this is something I think the Baha'i community thinks a lot about. So the Baha'i community across the world is engaged in a process of a grassroots educational process that's really thinking about how more and more people can become involved in the transformation of their community, recognizing that each individual has the capacity to read their reality and to contribute to the betterment of their neighborhood and of the world in general. And so we think a lot about how can we bring in more and more people into this process. So that's something, this idea of participation and how do we increase the number of people who are involved in the betterment of the world is something that we also wanted to think about at the national level, particularly around the question of racial justice. So then that brought us into conversation with people like Laura and Matt, in addition to these personal relationships that we had and that we have been building. So that sort of brings us here. But I think it would be nice also, I don't know if you want to add anything, PJ, but also if Laura and Matt wanted to share, like you had mentioned, Masood wanted to share a little bit more about their work.
PJ, did you have anything you wanted to add on to what May was saying?
Yeah, I guess the only thing just in relation to racial justice and participation, just to build on what May was saying, that I think that that both Matt and Laura and the nature of our conversations with them is related to the capacity of everyone to contribute to an America that is free of racial prejudice, that it's not any one person's job, but that by the nature of the way that racial prejudice functions in society, people are at different levels of consciousness and understanding about the depth and the impact of this issue in America. And so then how do you create environments and communities and relationships that accommodate different paces and strides and really help everyone see themselves? I think the phrase that May and I have been playing with in our work is, how do you help everyone see themselves as champions of racial justice and unity? What does it mean to, no matter your place in society, no matter your role, how do you see yourself as championing racial justice and unity? And then I think, how does that then connect to championing what it means to be human, what it means to really allow our nobility as human beings to be the dominating force and guiding, the guide for the type of society we're trying to build. So I think like thinking differently about participation in activism and change and racial justice work has been the nature of the conversations that we've been having with Matt and Laura. So that's kind of why we asked them to be part of this conversation and the inspiration behind it. But yeah, so I'll ask, maybe Matt can start and introduce himself.
Hey y'all, thanks for asking me to participate in this discussion. I'm quite excited. My name is Matt Burkhold. I am the founder and many titles. I wear many hats at Visionary Organizing Lab. And as my bio said, I'll keep this real short. My bio said I've been involved in movements for social change for almost 2 decades. And I've had my own journey towards personal transformation over those 2 decades that have culminated in the work we do at Visionary Organizing Lab. And I got involved in organizing, to use the language we're using today, organizing for racial justice on college campuses in the early 2000s. And I had a moment after, I was in a bunch of collectives and organizations, and in the mid 2000s, I was a member of the National Hip Hop Political Convention, a national organization that had local chapters throughout the country. And when Sean Bell was killed in New York City in 2006, and then his murderers were acquitted the following spring, we were at a demonstration outside the Queens County Courthouse, and justifiably very angry. And a woman who went to the protest together, she turned to me, she said, how might this be different if there were therapists out here? And that question, I marked that question because it was a moment where I began to reflect on the limitations of righteous indignation towards transforming the world and creating the world that we want to live in. And so I've gone through a series of personal transformations. And, today we use the language of healing. I've healed personal wounds that came from both the family I was in and the society in which I was reared, that have helped me to articulate questions around the relationship between how we must transform ourselves in relationship to transforming the world, to create a world that is dignity affirming, sustainable, and in which human beings can be and practice our full humanity. And so my work at Visionary Organizing Lab is about supporting people to create and connect experiments that are dignity affirming, sustainable, in the form of new economies, institutions, and cultural practices. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brother Matt. I appreciate that. Laura, you want to share something?
I too probably came into the work that I've been doing for the last 15 or so years through my college experience, of which PJ was a big part. I had the opportunity as a upper middle class white girl from the suburbs of St. Louis to go to college in Boston. And it really opened my world and gave me a vocabulary to talk primarily about race, which was and is a defining feature of St. Louis's landscape, as it is for many cities. But particularly for my schooling growing up, my graduating class was our last class to be in the court-mandated busing program. And that was a major issue talked about throughout my high school graduation year. And I didn't really have the language when I left home at 18 to talk about what I observed, but I really cared about history and learning more about my place in it. And I really cared about, my role in the world and making it a better place. I've always felt very strongly that that's what we're here to do. And that's always been really connected for me to my Jewish identity. So I went to college not really knowing what I would do, and then fell into the world of American studies. And I felt that when I learned American history told through a multiracial lens, it suddenly made a lot more sense. And I often reflect to people that the course of my career has caused me to again and again need to answer the question for myself and others, like, how do we get folks who are not inclined to see themselves as part of the story of justice work, and with racial justice work, that's often white folks. Like, how do we get folks to not come at this with a defensive stance, to not be thrown off by one word or language and, freak out? And I always reflect back to how fortunate I was to have a key moment in my life where my identity was shifting and growing, like a lot of young people, where I saw so many ways that it grew and benefited me to better understand the truth of our country, to be able to understand the story and values of my family and our immigrant story inside a bigger frame. And I really felt like, why wasn't I taught this before? And in fact, the majority of organizing work and then got involved with on campus was about getting our campus to have more courses in Asian American studies, where we were particularly weak as a campus. And I always told people, especially from the context of living in St. Louis, which has a very strong black-white dynamic, understanding Asian American history made the world 3D. And I still feel that way. And so that those same themes have come around to me again and again. I've done a lot of work that's really organizational change work in large institutions. What does it take for organizations to align the impact they want in the world with the way they're set up internally? And what does change look like, and how do you get people on board? I've been on the ground organizer for a lot of different initiatives, and most recently I spent 4.5 years launching anti-racist parenting community in St. Louis after the events of Ferguson, which was like the moment I moved back to St. Louis as a wayward child. And so I think again and again, I've just come to this question, like, what's my stake in this? That I think is what really drives me and has drawn other people towards work that I care about. And I always find that, like, I get a deeper layer of myself when I'm able to build community with others towards a more just world.
So interesting to me, because the values and the things that you all are expressing in your response to this question, I think are so transcendent, right? Doesn't matter what particular cultural background you come from, what religious tradition that you come from, those values are really universal in a sense and kind of knit us together. And, it's interesting to me how these different historical moments have really been a catalyst for you to be engaged, for the both of you to be engaged in this kind of work. Brother Matt talked about killing a brother back in the day when you were involved with the hip hop organization, National Hip Hop Organization. You talked about what was happening in Ferguson, Laura. And we're in a very interesting moment, right? I mean, where these racialized incidents just seem to be coming one after the other, right? And it's also a moment where the knowledge of that is also backed up by technology, right? So there's a validating apparatus, right? That in some sense, because previously we knew that these kinds of incidents were taking place, right? But always, it generally speaking, was the Black community who was the victim of these types of incidents, letting the larger society know that these are going on, but we always seem to need an affidavit or some type of corroborating witness from the white community to validate what it is that we're saying. But of course, now we have this technological apparatus that validates that for us. And I'm really interested in, you know, everything that's going on now. And Matt, you talked about the limits of righteous indignation, which I thought was really profound. And talking about transformational change, right? What does that look like? What does enduring transformational change look like? And I'm really interested to hear what your individual ideas are behind that. Not just change that is, you know, perhaps it is motivated by kind of righteous indignation, but we also know that, you know, that has to, for change to be enduring and truly transformational, it has to go beyond that, right? It has to involve some really practical methodologies that will allow that transformation to be sustained. So I'm really interested in just unpacking what your ideas are behind this idea, this concept of transformational change. What does it mean for you? And Laura, if you want to go first this time, because I think Matt hit it first the last time. So.
Oh, sure. You know, while you were talking, what I think a lot about is how we go from something being so big that it's shocking in its enormity, right? Yeah. We can't even absorb it, versus something believable, tangible, and personal. Because I think that really catalyzes people to move. And it's very true that, you know, for me, I moved back to St. Louis after, I mean, everyone who knows me from college would say I've been talking about moving to back to St. Louis since I left. And it took me 12 years. I finally moved home on August 9, 2014, which was the very day that Michael Brown was shot. And I just felt like this is telling me something, right? But I've thought a lot since about, you know, why this incident, why did it hit differently? You know, pieces of it were because of the timing, because I was a mother, because this, because that. But also, I think it's about hearing a story in a personal enough way, with a messenger close enough that you begin to metabolize it. And I've been thinking a lot in the last few years between Michael Brown's death and now, and the George Floyd uprising and what we've seen about what it takes to metabolize pain, and like that's a practice and a habit, and our culture is really ill-suited towards that, and some of us, depending on our landscape as targeted folks, have to develop those skills, right? So the best corollary I have in my own life, this past November, I traveled to EJI, the Legacy Museum and Lynching Memorial, with a multiracial, multi-faith group from St. Louis. And I went with the Jewish Community Relations Council. And it was really clear, like from the moment I walked into the Lynching Museum and seeing the pictures too, it felt to me like, for me as a Jewish person going to Yad Vashem, which is a very, it's a Holocaust museum in Israel, but unlike a Holocaust museum in the US, it doesn't put the history forward first. It puts like the art of pain basically forward first. It's a place of collective mourning. And, you know, I'm a parent of a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I've had to talk to them about who they are, and that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor and what that means. And so, you know, as I'm going through that as a parent, I'm like, wow, I've had to take slices of this. What is 6 million? What is 6 million? What does that mean? And I was instructed in how to do that my whole life. And it is not till I stood in EJI's memorial that I had ever been asked to just grapple with the monumental scale of death that slavery and racial injustice wrought, you know? So I've been thinking a lot about that you can't, you actually, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And so I think that's where some of these pieces come together for me, that like, if we don't have the history, if we don't do it with our young kids, if we don't talk to our young kids about race and racism, the shock, the disconnect, the disbelief, you know, some of that comes from personal readiness, and some of it I think comes from human nature, that to just absorb how terrible and painful and inhumane humans can really be. It's a huge, that's a huge endeavor. You can't do it in one bite, you know? So that's what I think about. And when you do it, when you have your first bite, it doesn't always take you to a place that you're like, let me get back in there, you know, or I want to make this my life's work, right? So those are the moments I find really interesting to think about, of how to slice that down into something that more people can find their way into and be like, you know what, there's a process here, there's a way. And we all have different traditions of how do we absorb like the difficulties of life, but this is a really important one, and we've really sold ourselves short as a society to like make a way to do that.
Thank you, Laura. Brother Matt, you wanted to add something to that, brother?
Sure. I believe that you asked how we might understand what transformation means, and I think that I want to affirm what Laura has said about an importance of understanding history. And I want to add, my work has taught me, my life, my work with other people has taught me that regardless of race, class, gender, sexuality, if you've grown up in this country, you are a wounded human. You are a wounded human being. I mean, we are. And I often ask people in trainings, you know, if you live in a world where your access to home and food is contingent upon your access to money, what chance do you have to believe that who you are really matters? And the answer is almost always very little chance. And so I think that for me, one of the questions of, you know, the saying that hurt people is something that I carry with me on a daily basis. And I try to practice empathy, you know, with human beings that I encounter. And I think that the flip side of that is that loved people are able to love people and act in loving ways. And so I think that what transformation looks like for me looks like human beings who are connected with our capacity to create, to shape, to matter, and have an impact on our immediate circumstances. I think that the language that May used in the introduction, and I'm paraphrasing, how increasing people can participate in the transformation of their communities. And I think that part of that for me is people who don't believe they have any power can often act in, quite conversely, actually, people who who don't believe they have any power can act in very harmful ways because they can't imagine that their actions have any impact. And so in some ways, people with very little power, very little understanding of their own power or belief in their own power can act in the same way that those with the most power who live just 27 blocks from me live. You know, in very contradictory ways to get there, but the outcome is somewhat similar in very particular ways. So the question I always raise is, what's necessary for people to understand our own power so that we might use it in ways that are nurturing, dignity affirming, and loving. Because I have a faith, and my experience has borne this out, that people who are aware of the, when I say people, I want to be very plain what I mean. People whose livelihood is not contingent upon maintaining an inhumane political, social, and economic system. I mean, regular people in neighborhoods and in the street. For people whose livelihood is not dependent upon acting in profoundly inhumane ways, when we have a sense that we have an impact on others, we tend to honor that impact, because at human beings' core is the desire to at least be decent, to not kill and maim. And so the question for me on transformation is, how do people come connected to our creative capacity to impact people, neighborhoods, cities, systems, and so on and so forth? Because my experience is talking that when we become connected to that creative sense, that creative capacity, we have an urging to use it responsibly and for the betterment of ourselves and others.
Man, brother, y'all dropping some gems, man. I really appreciate you all sharing. The way you all are talking about this kind of like engagement across communities, right? Across entrenched divisions, right? We know that fundamentally that the notion of race is a sociological construct. It doesn't have anything to do with a kind of fundamental reality to human creation, right? And at the same time, we know that pigmentation, the color of your skin, has real world implications in terms of where you can go and what possibly can happen to you. Do you have access to levers of power, to economic viability, those sorts of things. And, I'm thinking about this idea of this kind of inherent nobility in all of us, right? Which is essentially is what the both of you are talking about as a motivating factor on the one hand, to go to EJI, to go to the lynching memorial and have that experience. I was fortunate enough to be there. I visited a few times myself, and Laura, I'm an African-American male, and it had, from the standpoint of my community, had a profound impact on me in that sense, but then also just in a human, in a way, in a larger context. Even if I wasn't, if you bring your heart and your soul to that space, you cannot help but be touched. And then Matt, you as well, talking about, this kind of like this idea of really our connectedness, our interconnectedness, regardless of what your background is. And I'm so interested in hearing about the both of you, your positionality in the world as two white people who would be considered white, right, in the context of race, right? And as you're doing this work on racial justice, and you're really interested in dismantling these systems of white supremacy, right, that have dogged our nation and have really served to undermine our collective progress as a community. I'm really interested how those dialogues are taking place, right? When you are entering into spaces and you're sharing your experience and your understanding of this work with white crowds, with white communities. What are those responses like? How do you see your engagement in those spaces? And can you just share a little bit about what that experience is like? Because I think you all bring a perspective, that conversation as members of that community, that I, as a Black man going into those spaces, right, would still be somewhat on the outside. You come with the experiential understanding of what that's like. And I'm just wondering, if you could share some of that. Love to hear that. Matt, you want to take that first, brother?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Masood. That's a journey. I remember when I was first of all, I left high school at 17 years old. And, under circumstances I won't get into today. But, suffice to say, I was a small-time nickel and dime hustler who wasn't going to graduate from school anyway, so I left. And because of my skin color, I grew up. I ran with a crew of 4 or 5 Black men who, as teenagers, we would go into stores and we would steal. And I would do the stealing because we knew security would follow them. and with security trailing them, you know, I could clean up. And I want to be plain that I've atoned for that behavior and amended all of that, you know. So, you know, that's far in my past. But so I had this understanding of what whiteness meant as a very young kid. And when I was like I said, my homeboys got locked up. I went to college. You know, I graduated from an alternative high school and then went to college. And it was never, you know, I knew that it was my white skin that enabled that. And I got a language to understand my experience when I was in college. And I went, oh, I got the language of whiteness and institutional and systemic racism and so on and so forth. And I said, oh, this helps me understand my experience and the experience of the guys I grew up with. And I said, you know what? I owe it to the kids of the guys I grew up with to contribute to creating a world where their children might be given the second chance that I got and their fathers deserved. And so my first road to that was, well, I'm gonna get a PhD, because if I'm a doctor, and I had this understanding that, you know, as a white guy, I can be heard saying things and not be dismissed as, you know, an angry black man or you know, whatever the reactionary flavor of the phrase is. And so I said, I'm gonna get a PhD because then I have to be taken seriously. And I'm here to tell you that white folks, they don't care. You know, that is just ridiculous. Like my journey was to understanding, oh, this PhD means nothing in the eyes of these people. I can be heard in some ways, but I have to be very creative in the way that I'm heard. And so what I've kind of learned over the years is so we use the language of dismantling systems. If I go into a white room and talk about dismantling systems, I am not heard. And I think that we are fooling ourselves if we believe that white people will ever dismantle a system that benefits them or us. And I think it is never in the political history of the world have people who have benefited from a system dismantled it. And so the tack I take is not to dismantle the system, but to develop a vision of what a new system might look like. To ask ourselves, what's it mean to be a human being? What do you want to feel like? And how does the world and system in which we live limit your ability to realize that? Because for me, with white folks, there are kind of two things that become really, really important to me. And I always think about James Baldwin's sentiment that white supremacy has damaged white folks more than it has anybody else. And we're living through right now. Like, I mean, I was talking with my partner the other day when Trump was diagnosed with COVID and then Pence refused to wear a mask and a plexiglass or, you know, whatever that was at the debate. You know, and I think about these folks in Michigan who tried to kidnap the governor because they wanted to use the gym. You know, whiteness is a suicidal identity. Because the average white person who is riding this hard is more committed to being white than they are to being alive. And I think that if we take that reality seriously, accept it for what it is, and then ask what might be possible, are these people capable of being transformed? And if so, what kind of support mechanisms, systems can facilitate that transformation? We have to project into the future. And in so doing, develop methods to address the past. Because my work with white folks has taught me that if we start with the past, we ain't moving forward. Because it is literally too painful. Because white folks, the average white person in the street has conflated whiteness with what it means to be a human being. And so to let go of whiteness is to embrace suicide in the existential mind of the average white person. And those are stakes that are really high. And so what I've kind of learned to do through a whole lot of trial and a whole lot of error is to go into spaces in a way that affirms how difficult the day-to-day lives of human beings, in this case, white human beings are, and then draw back to how structural realities, rather than, you know, somebody of a different skin color is responsible for that, so that we might move forward in the creation of something that allows everyone, including white people, to realize their full humanity.
Wow, it's wonderful. Thank you, brother. Laura?
Yeah, I love that. I've become really bought into the idea that white folks need to spend a lot of time thinking about how whiteness shapes them, and that becomes profoundly meaningful to them. And it's only in doing that that you can be effective in cross-race relationships. And I think it's an ongoing piece of work. I think, you know, I definitely live and come from a different lived experience than Matt has spoken to, in terms of, like, I mean, my family growing up was like, the growing pains was like exactly what my family was like. So like, I'm like a sitcom, suburban, white mainstream girl who still loves my Gap t-shirts, like, and so what I've been thinking about while Matt has been talking is my journey has really been about accepting complicity, dismantling from where I am. And I don't feel like I've had the option of looking away from my role in this system. And I have found ways to bring people along in doing that. And there are a lot of enders to that, but I guess what I've come to find is a couple things. Like, I think that you would think, or many people would think, that white folks don't really want to talk about race because they're pretty bad at it, and they get very emotionally responsive to conversations about race. But I've come to believe that most white people actually really deeply long to talk about race. They feel pretty profoundly confused about it, and they lack a lot of language or space to work out their own ideas about it. And so when they do some of that working out, it's incredibly traumatizing for people of color, because they're saying things that are appropriate for like somebody who just arrived on this planet to say, but not really great to hear from, you know, an adult. And so, but on the flip side, it really doesn't feel great in your 30s, or really I think most white people develop their racial identity through highly segregated realities. They live in a bubble where language is never spoken to. And so there's a dearth of conversation. That was my experience. And then I know a lot of people like me who then had their first consciousness of race as significant to them in college. So that still means you're in your late teens or 20s before like one of the most significant identity shaping forces in our entire society is revealed as significant to you, you know? And so you're like decades behind your peers. And that doesn't happen for a lot of people, right? They don't have that moment. So then it's the workforce, right? They have work. So, you know, it's like if you arrived at work and you've never seen a computer before, and then everybody tells you this is essentially how you're performing your job. You're going to do your best to be like, sure. This makes sense. Or you're going to freak out and say, this is a demon machine, get it away from me. You know, like, it doesn't feel good as an adult, and our culture doesn't have any way for people to like save face about what they don't know. I have a wonderful mentor here who started a program here called Witnessing Whiteness that was laying long groundwork in the St. Louis community before Ferguson. She was a Black woman who really saw the need for white folks to do affinity group work. And what she would say to folks is, well, how long have you lived on this earth? And they'd say, well, I'm 62, I'm 45, and whatever. Do you know everything there is to know about apples? You've probably eaten an apple. Like, do you know all the variables and da. It's like, why would you expect yourself to know all this, right? So I think getting people into a learner's mindset is critically important. Basically, what I have found is people who are able to encounter race as one facet of of their story inside humanity, not totally tied and wedded, as Matt was talking about, to their humanity, but something they can see and come out of and see their humanity beyond that. I think a key feature is they've had some other transformational identity experience, and that brought them to race and anti-racism as white folks. So I think if you talk, they had a cancer journey, or a job loss, or a really significant person in their life, a partner or a child. I mean, something changed for them personally in how they understood themselves. So I came to think about, like, well, we're never going to get white people to talk about race. And after Ferguson here specifically, it was so eerie to me that you could travel in parts of St. Louis and it was like, it was as if this hadn't happened at all. And meanwhile, you know, for that year, you know, every cover of every magazine was like, how is Ferguson, US? And how is this? And how is that? You know, and there were 100 days of sustained protest in the street. That takes a lot. You know, so it was weird. You're like, what are we doing? So I came to feel that we had to reach people at a transformational moment, because when everything's up in the air about your identity, you have to figure it out differently. You have to, and I think becoming a parent is one of those critical moments. And I think what it does for people is what Matt was talking about is this vision of the future and this creating a future. You know, every parent is thinking about the future in profoundly new ways, but I don't think you can escape the past. And I think every parent knows that too. The moment you find yourself, you know, you like hear your own parent's voice coming through your mouth and you're like, what, how did that just happen? Right. So I think there's like, it's like this beautiful window of like, we are the past, like the past builds up in us. And if we want to do something different, we're going to have to gain a lot of skills. And we're going to have a community, and we're going to have to learn things we don't know. And you know what? We're going to mess up. And you know what? We could yell at our kids all day on Saturday and they're still here Sunday morning, and we got to do it again. Like, and I don't think for white folks like that like consistent engagement, I think that those of us who were raised in highly segregated settings, that's one of the biggest things, is there's not enough frequency of grappling with race, that you go from feeling like, you know, unsure and awkward in how you're speaking, in how you're grappling with things, in your knowledge, to trying ideas on to any sense of mastery. You basically go from grappling to like, oh, I guess I don't really know what I'm doing. I'll go back here into my segregation. And you just wait till the next like explosion of American life. And I think what we're seeing now is, you know, we're living in a time where these moments of dynamic tension just keep coming. So you can't, there's nowhere to put your head in the sand.
Yeah. I mean, you've touched on so many things which I think are really interesting. A couple of things, this intersectionality of the past and the present, which I think is really interesting, how those two realities are constantly, in some sense, buttressing up against each other or bumping up against one another. I think implicit in what you also just said is this kind of intentionality in terms of engaging community. Also those who aren't from your own community of origin. I mean, this of building relationships and partnerships across cultures. And I'm thinking, you know, in the Baha'i community right now, we're engaged in this process of our own process of kind of social change, transformative social change, which is called the Core Activities, which is this series of like junior youth empowerment workshops, children's classes, devotional gatherings, all kind of geared towards helping to spiritualize our community, right? And to build deeper connections with our community. And at the heart of that is this kind of like intentional relationship building, right? That is really, really focused on us getting to know one another, regardless of whatever camp we come from, social, economic, ethnic, cultural, what have you. And this stuff is hard work, man. I mean, it is, to be engaged in this stuff is hard work on a day-to-day basis. And what I'm really interested in, and I know this is probably going to have to be our last question before we go to our break. And I want to hear from PJ and also May and also Laylee in response to this question as well. Where do you, man, when this stuff gets hard, man, where y'all going to replenish, to restore, to galvanize the energy, right? To get up the next day and continue to do the work? What are your touchstones of inspiration, of your source of strength, your what keeps you pushing when it's so hard sometimes to do the work? And anybody who wants to, maybe while we start, Laylee, you got something you want to share on this?
As I've said to many people, if you don't have a source of self-restoration, this world and this time that we're in will wipe you out. For me, there are really two sources that I turn to every single day. One is just reminding myself to be conscious of my relationship with God, because God is an inexhaustible source of all that is. And anytime I immerse myself in that awareness, I'm recharged. But I also find that I take, great peace in nature. The sun comes up every day. Every morning I look at the sunset, and every day the sun rises, I go, it's a new day and I could start over. And that, recognizing that there's this bigger universe that we're all part of, it gives me a kind of peace that enables me to recharge and move forward again each day. I will also add too, prayer is a part of it, because I think particularly, with Baha'u'llah, I love to use the book Prayers and Meditations, because Baha'u'llah went through a lot of suffering. It's very, very clear in the prayers he wrote in Prayers and Meditations. And to know that I'm not the first to suffer, I'm not the last to suffer, the people around me, but yet we ought to seek liberation together. And we have this great opportunity when we can come together. That is also very energizing.
Prayer and meditation is critical for me. Before I was stuck in the house, also just kind of communing with people was critical too, because it's in relationship to others. And there are kind of three things: there's meditation, there's prayer, and there's service to others. Like those three things, thinking about other people more than myself somehow gives me the strength to love, and practice that love. And so but the meditation is critical, and nature. Anything I can do to remind myself, anything I can do to right size myself is critical. I was 3 weeks ago, I was just depressed about, the dumpster fire that is the world. I come from I spent a lot of time being real self-destructive and hung out with a lot of real self-destructive people, and have been transformed. And I was in meditation a few weeks ago, and I said, who am I to believe that this can't be a restorative, transformative moment for humanity as a whole? If I've been transformed, who am I to believe that not everybody be transformed by the atrocities that they see around themselves every day? Like Laura said, there's no place to stick your head in the sand anymore. And it's in meditation, it's in prayer, and it's in service where I get the perspective to respond to these crises in ways that are hopeful. And it's in community with others that I get the ability to respond to the crises in hopeful rather than despairing ways.
Man, I appreciate that so much. May, would you like to share something?
Yeah, and I think in my response to this question, I also wanted to pick up on some things. I feel like Laura and Matt were also sparking thoughts in me, but I think it also answers your question, Masood. In thinking about the role of community, and also the role of relationships, and the nature of the relationships that we have with each other, and how that can also lead to transformation. One in the US, I feel like our community lives have been so interrupted by racism and by institutional racism, by the way that our communities have been segregated and separated one from another, and the fact that people tend to live in homogenous neighborhoods, homogenous, both skin color, but also, of course, socioeconomic status, and really like sometimes at the level of what people believe also becomes reinforced at that level. So thinking about like, how much transformation can we make in our society if we are able to actually engage, like what is the role of the community in also creating this transformation? And if we're able actually to build relationships with each other that exist beyond just the built communities that we have so far that have been sort of forced upon us, but actually like maybe we choose where we choose to live is affected by our beliefs in the kind of society we want. We think about living in a different community maybe than the one that we're raised in. We think about how that affects like where we send our children to school. Like how do we actually live our values, and what's the role of the community in that? And then also the nature of the relationships that we have with each other. So much transformation is possible if we actually like, one, believe in the capacity of people to transform. And also like people remain so other and so in theory when we don't know anyone who actually is of that group. So once we actually are able to have relationships with people across difference, how much that changes how we act and how we, the type of world that we want to live in. But also there thought has to be given to the nature of what that relationship should look like, right? So in addition to believing in that people have the capacity to change, we have to be patient with each other. We have to be loving. We have to listen. We have to be attentive. We have to recognize that a lot of these principles that we want to see in action, we also have the capacity to do. So justice, while it is a force in society, it's also like every human being has the capacity to act justly. So that also has to be something that characterizes the relationships that we have with each other. And connected to that is, which is an answer to your question, Masood, is also that like, those are the things that I draw strength from. I draw strength from my community, from the community that I've chosen, but also the community that I live in, the people that I build relationships with, what's the nature of the relationships, how we're thinking about each other, especially in this time where we have to also for our safety sort of be separate from each other in one sense, but also we are really have the opportunity, because people are so like the needs are so immense, that we have the opportunity to really serve the people who live right where we do. To be concerned if they have the material things that they need, but also like the spiritual things that they need to endure a time of great turmoil. So I draw a lot of strength from my community and from the relationships that I have with people.
Building on some of the conversation from before and thinking about your question, I think that, racism's, I've heard two different people say, Brian Stevenson says, racism's greatest power is proximity. And I think Toni Morrison says that racism's greatest power is distraction. And I think that those two things, I think, are pretty profound. One is that, and I think they relate to racism's relationship to materialism. So I think that racism, as in sense of proximity, is connects to what May was saying in terms of segregation in society, and how it perpetuates a sense of otherness. But then it also has what Matt was talking about earlier. It segregates us from our heart. It segregates us from our soul. It segregates us from what makes us noble and human. And then I think this idea of distraction, we just live in an overpowering materialistic society in America. I mean, your material comfort is just a predominating concern of so many people, right? It's trying to just accumulate stuff, and it's really truly a powerful means to support a certain structure, but totally distracts you from your true life, the life of your soul. And I think, being able to really have a powerful network of people who are helping you contribute to your own transformation, and also helping you contribute to the transformation of the community that you're a part of, I think is very empowering. And just to give an example, I have one of my father's best friends' name is from Detroit. He's like an old head classic Detroit. He is able to mix humor and profundity in incredible ways. And I always turn to him, and I just talked to him the other day, and he did not disappoint. He gave me so many pieces of wisdom, but I was feeling, just personally feeling pretty disconnected from my soul, pretty sick with materialism. And he said, you don't think you're worthy, and you ain't. But if you weren't worthy, God wouldn't have given you what he gave you. So you got to love yourself. And I was just thinking, there's so much truth in that, in terms of we really aren't worthy of this world. In many ways, we don't act worthy. But, as creations of God, we carry nobility in us inherently, and we are all connected inherently. So it's just a matter of like freeing our wings a little bit so that we can soar together. So I think being able to really be in a posture of transformation, which requires humility and really learning, I think, and something that kind of came up throughout this was this posture of learning through action, reflection, consultation, and study. I think these are sort of themes that have run throughout the conversation, and if you can maintain that posture as much as possible on a daily basis with others, I think that's a really profound step to address deep systemic issues that have emerged from rampant materialism and racism. So it's, I think, working from the small and to address the big. Like, how do you develop nuclei in communities that are healthy, that are evolving and reflecting a mature human reality? I think is very profound and will have lasting change.
Thank you, brother. Sister Laura, you want to bring it home?
Oh man, I feel like, for me, the sound of PJ's voice is like a deep restorative. I'm like,
he does have like a smooth jazz thing going on.
Oh man. So sometimes I watch his YouTube storytelling, which I would recommend to everyone when you need a recharge. But other than what a lot of what people said, I feel like it's taken me a long time to come to, like the role of prayer in nature. And I think what hasn't been said but's been consistent for me is time with my family, which I know is so basic, but I find it really deeply restorative. And I too think of, I have some people in my life like PJ who have literally met like every member of my family because we're a pretty tight-knit crew. And also reading fiction, that has always been a place for me. And the more, when I was in a particularly low period and decided I needed to make a list of like, what are my like self-care things, which started on the Post-it that just said, read novels. I was like, ooh, this is gonna have to branch out a little bit here. But as Matt was talking today, I think feeding your imagination, like, is one of the biggest things, because it reminds you of your capacity to create. And for me, fiction and stories about people and their lives and how they think about things, it's just, I find that profoundly interesting. And sometimes I can get bogged down in the realness of like doing that work with other people. But I always find joy in being able to go into that with fiction. So that's really restorative for me.
Wow. Well, thank you all so much. I mean, this is, we didn't have enough time. We didn't nearly have enough time. I mean, we could continue this conversation for another hour and barely scratch the surface. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then we're going to come back for a little bit of Q&A. But before we do that, I just wanted to thank you all for just bringing your heart, man, your spirit, and your learning, to this conversation. And when I think about hope for me, you all have shared so many of the strategies and methodologies that I try to employ: prayer, reflection, those types of things. But also when I'm in conversations like this that are diverse, that are loving, that are grounded in an ethos of redemption and transformative change, that gives me hope. So I'm just so excited to be in this space with you all and to be sharing just a little bit of time and learning a lot from all of you. So thank you. Okay, so we have a question. This first question is from Sierra, and this is specifically for the Office of Public Affairs. And the question is, how can your office advocate specifically for economic justice when the disparity between rich and poor has become so astronomically disparate, with billionaires and now talk of trillionaires, when we are becoming more corporatized with political interests vested in this wealth and influenced by this wealth more than ever? How do you climb this steep hill? What is the approach? A little light question for PJ and May to handle. So, hey, what y'all have at?
Yes, a big question. And you know, Matt thinks a lot about the connections of race, wealth, nature, so he may have a thought on it too. But you know, our office, just like we follow a discourse on race and racial justice, and we also follow a discourse on economic inequality. And we recently started a economic justice discourse space, dialogue space that happens, you know, every 3 months. And it's a sort of brings together people who are practitioners in all kinds of sectors at the national level, to really have a conversation about the fundamental assumptions underpinning the current economic structures, and to identify some of what are the moral frameworks that would help us advance to a more just economic structure. And really sort of unearthing those questions at the level of principle. And I think, you know, just to be clear, you know, our office really focuses at the level of thought and language, and trying to evolve consciousness through contributing to that evolution, recognizing that there is an intimate connection between language, consciousness, and action. And so I think by envisioning with a growing group of people from in society who work in this area about the moral worth of economic structures and how we can re-envision those and actually start to put those into practice, I think it will start to have an impact in the discourse on economic inequality.
Thank you, brother. Sister May, did you want to add something to that, or he's got it? He's good. Matt, PJ had mentioned that you were interested in this area. Is there a piece that you want to add to his comments?
The short answer is we can create a new economy. And that is the necessary answer to, I believe. I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now, we have to realize the emergence of capitalism over 400 years ago does not happen without the extermination of indigenous people throughout the Americas, the enslavement of Africans, the burning of women accused of being witches throughout the European continent. This is capitalism and love cannot coexist. It cannot. Yeah. And as the system has aged and developed, it's become harder and harder to structurally contain that contradiction and the inhumanity of the system. So I say that to say that the current disparity between the wealthy and the poor, and the physical repression of poor people housed in the prison industrial complex, is not an aberration. It is a logical outgrowth of a system whose fundamental contradiction is that between wealth creation or profit and welfare. Wealth creation necessarily neglects welfare of humanity, nature, and the environment. And a system that has that as its poles can only do what this system is doing. So we need something new.
Thank you, brother. Anybody else want to add anything onto that? Something burning that you want to add? We good? Okay. All right. Thank you all so much for those responses, man. It's beautiful, beautiful.
Masu, can I pull one in?
Please, go right ahead. Go right ahead, please.
I was very fascinated with a couple of questions that came in that I think can be pulled into a common question, in the sense that they both had to do with how you deal with different aspects of whiteness. Julia Ames came in with a question that said, so how do we now today connect with those extremist white people? She says, I live in Idaho, in a college town with people on all parts of the political spectrum. People have been protesting, mass, etc. During BLM protests, militias with guns came out to protest against them. How do we connect with people on opposite sides of the issues? This is splitting our small town apart. What do we do? That's one piece of the question. The other piece of another person's question, an anonymous attendee, basically was asking, particularly of Matt and Laura, how do you deal with it when your credibility to speak to these issues is questioned because you are white? You know, there's always that question about, you know, how much can you really weigh in on issues that may have more relevance for Black, Indigenous, people of color, et cetera. So I see these two questions as being part of a common kind of question about how whiteness shows up in the racial justice movement in different places. So if you all, anyone could speak to that, I think it would make for a great discussion.
I'm happy to take a stab. You know, I think it's a huge question inside white anti-racist work about like, what is your lane? What is the role of white folks in the racial justice movement overall? And who do we need with us in order to make this change, right? So first of all, I don't think there's a static answer, and there's not one answer. That's like the most important thing. And almost any question about race and whiteness comes down to like really pulling apart like the underlying like message in white culture that there's one right way to do things, and that most things are an either or binary. So I really believe strongly that first of all, being brave in your own moral courage and demonstrating what matters to you and why it matters to you, it brings a lot of people along. People are always watching, you know. I think, you know, a lot of time inside white communities is spent on policing each other's behavior, just as whiteness polices all people of color's behavior. That is a characteristic of white supremacy, right? So being brave enough to say, like, this is true for me and it matters, and if it matters to me, it matters to others, and living that truth is very, very compelling, and it's very countercultural. And so the reason I feel like that answers different things is it's not my place to explain, you know, how racism works to people of color. They have their own experience, but I can tell how it's worked upon me. That is a story I can add. And I think we are kind of thin on real stories about white folks grappling with what race means to them. I think we need a lot. And so I think that's the way I think about it, is like broadening out those models. And somebody else asked about the importance of doing this work collectively, right? So what happens, what becomes possible, or a key thing that has driven my work is what happens when, as a white parent, you don't think, well, I can either be in the streets protesting Ferguson and making that decision, am I going to burn a trash can or not? As if like every protest you go to, like they stop you at the door and they're like, you ready to burn something? Oh, okay. So, you know, either I'm that, or I just never mention this again. Those are pretty far apart. Like, let's start filling in 9,000 different ways to be in this fight, right? And so when I authentically live my way of doing that, it says to someone else, like, oh, I can find my story. It's more like, if she can, I can too. And so I think what I've grappled with, because I also live in a context where, you know, militias are right at my door. I'm not the right person to talk to a lot of Trump supporters, because I live what May described about like all my neighbors agree with me, and we're all pretty wealthy and we're all pretty white. I don't have a lot of friends who are really deep Trump supporters, but you know what I do have is a lot of friends who their parents are, and the people they grew up with. And in what we created with We Stories, I thought some of the most hardening work was seeing people figure out, how do they stay in relationship with family members they profoundly disagree with? How do they love through that? How do they live their truth through that? And people move and they do come along. I think what's scary about that approach is the level of violence that we're at, you know? And so, you know, there are moments that we need to stand up and just call the dangerous, like, white supremacy violence exactly what it is. And there are moments we need to sit down and have Thanksgiving dinner with the same people, or be the person our friend can call from their coat closet when they're having Thanksgiving dinner with the same people. And I've done those things. And it's hard. That's really hard work. But I can't be at that Thanksgiving dinner, but thank God that person is, because they're having that conversation. That's how it's going to change, in my opinion.
It's interesting for me because coming from the perspective of an African-American male who part of the work that I do deals with history. And a lot of the books that I've read historically dealing with issues of Blackness, the history of racism and violence visited upon the Black body, social economic disenfranchisement visited upon Black communities, are written from the perspective of Black folk, right? And what I've noticed is, in particular when it comes to things like the slave narratives, the stories about the period of enslavement, right? They're written from the perspective of the enslaved. And I must confess that when I read Stephen Ball's Slaves in the Family, it was really eye-opening for me to see a white person who is a descendant of slave owners talking about how that impacted his life and how he was processing that. And I think it's part of that getting to know each other, right? So these stories are told and shared, and it deepens the kind of collective understanding I find for me personally. So I'm missing, I want more of that kind of transparency and those narratives brought to the table so that we have more of a rounded understanding of how people are processing and thinking about things and how these things have impacted their lives. I find that to be a very interesting part of the conversation. Oftentimes that is missing. So, yeah.
Laura, thank you. I really appreciate your answer. Really, really appreciate your answer. I find it very useful. I have long pondered this question of how militias are responded to. Literally, 13 white men were arrested on Thursday for a plot to assassinate. You know, that's not the legal charge. Let's call it what it was, to assassinate the governor of a state. I honestly have to ask the question, and this may not be a very popular question. Do we have the skills? Do we have the framework and capacity to transform those people at this moment? And I think that what we have to really face is some hard truths about what whiteness means at its most extreme manifestation. I don't have an answer to that. I know that in dealing with individual Trump supporters, my uncle voted for Trump. I got family members that, ride for this dude. Ride for him. And on an individual basis, I have conversations with them about, what values do you want to see in the world? What should the world look like? And that's one thing, dealing with them. When you talk about people who already have guns and who are willing to, literally these 13 gentlemen had the aim of provoking a civil war. And we'd be some fools to not acknowledge that those people exist everywhere, everywhere. And I think that the question of how you reach across that difference and work with people, the last time that question was raised, it culminated in a civil war in this country. And I mention this because I wouldn't be responsible. I couldn't sleep with myself if I didn't name that as a potential outcome of the conditions that exist in this country. And I think that the question that we have to ask ourselves, in addition to this very important question of how you work across that difference, is where we muster and gather the spiritual resources to continue doing the work if there are segments of this population who would rather die themselves and destroy the entire country then they would see it be transformed into a more humane place. Because that is a spiritual wherewithal that I'm searching for at the moment that I have yet to find and develop, but feel as though I desperately need it. And I want to speak very quickly to the other question about, questions of legitimacy, being a white person. The question was, how do I respond to that? I think that part of it, there have been a lot of times where I've just kind of been dismissed offhand. And I think that what I've learned is that when I'm able to speak the language of the heart rather than the language of the head, dismissal just very seldom happens. If I'm able to connect to somebody at the heart, it's rooted in love. It's rooted in the affirmation of their dignity. And somehow that transforms us and softens us to the degree we're willing to listen to other people. I just don't know what that looks like in immediate circumstances where the people who need to approach these people could very well be killed. It's a choice between, martyrdom or something else. I don't know.
Thank you for that, brother.
You're asking some very challenging questions, Matt, but I remain optimistic. Maybe it's because I'm a developmental psychologist and I think about how human beings are always in motion across the lifespan, and that there's always a relationship between the characteristics of the social context and the characteristics of individuals and the way they show up. And I truly believe that regardless of what we're manifesting, all of us have a spiritual nature inside that's waiting to be watered by the right kind of water, and that water wakens up that spirit. I truly believe that. I've experienced that. I've experienced that with people who have very different beliefs than I do. When I was living in the South, I have a few notable memories of having conversations with people that I knew any other day wouldn't be spending time talking to a Black person, but we found our way to a place we could converse by talking about Christianity, because even though, their understanding of Christianity and my understanding of Christianity were a little different, we were able to find some common ground there by talking about the Bible. You know what I mean? And I've also been in instances with children who are beginning to learn those viewpoints from the people around them, but how easily children's hearts are rerouted by love, by friendship, by kindness, by taking an interest in them, by being genuinely curious about them, and by helping them imagine their futures. I just think we have so many avenues, even as hard as things look. I never want to give up on the optimism that we have so many avenues and so many points of intervention. And it's, somebody put in the chat, isn't the white supremacist living his or her beliefs too? That's one view, but I go back to your point about the heart. The head and the heart aren't always the same approach. There's a way to speak to the soul, speak to the heart, the way to connect there. I love all the stories that the National Center for Race Amity is always putting out about these unlikely cross-racial friendships. My favorite one is, Zernona Clayton and the Grand Dragon of the KKK. How did they become friends? How did that lead to a moment of transformation? It did, and so I've just, as hopeless as things seem right now, I will be that lady that's always saying we still have places where we can come together.
Thank you, Laylee.
I think we may have time for two more questions. As an African-American Baha'i, I see there is a stratification among ourselves by class. The brown bag test, is he Black enough? And the Black intelligentsia. We have to be conscious of our implicit conditioning. What are your thoughts? So I suppose that this is probably one for May or PJ or myself or Laylee. Of course, Matt and Laura can jump in as they feel, but we can start off. Maybe May wants to say something to that. What are you thinking, May?
Yeah, I think that, as just because we Baha'is, we have a certain set of principles that we believe in, or a certain, maybe like an example that we're trying to follow, doesn't mean that we're not, a human being living in the world, right? So we are organic with our environment. We are susceptible to the same trials and tribulations that everyone else is facing, and it's possible for us to take in racism and take in racist beliefs or other prejudices. And I think that that's also like mentioned in the writings of our faith, that it is possible for that to happen to us, and that's why we have to be vigilant, and we have to really seek to to put these principles into action, and not just think that because we espouse a certain belief or we believe in Baha'u'llah, it's enough to inoculate us against the ills of society. So the way that we inoculate ourselves against the ills of society is to actually put into practice what we believe. And a lot of the things that we've talked about in terms of and that people have brought up in terms of how some of these fundamental beliefs about like how we view each other and how we think of ourselves and how we think of our like the type of contribution we can make, like you have to have those things in action, and it's only like through action that we can begin to really recognize even what things that we think that we don't know that we think. So we might think of ourselves as loving everyone, but it's not until you are confronted with someone who's different than you realize that, oh, I have a problem loving that person because of X, Y, and Z. And so it's important for us to not rest on our laurels or on a name that we call ourselves, but actually to try and root out and have freedom from prejudice be the watchword of the work that we're doing, and actually meditate on what is the meaning of the principles that we believe in.
I'll just add to that. I was thinking about the difference between a process of education and a process of training. And I think, right now there's a lot of emphasis on anti-bias training, anti-racist training. But I think, which I think has an incredible usefulness, utility for people to recognize things that they didn't understand and such. But I think one of the things when I look at the people in this panel, they're all connected or committed to a process of education. And when I say process of education, I really mean thinking about how you enable yourself and others to walk a path of transformation on which you are becoming increasingly conscious of the meaning and significance of what you are actually doing. The meaning and significance of who you are as a person, and all of the relationships that you're connected to. And I think that there is this sort of, in an education process, there's a relationship between the growth of consciousness and, as May was saying, this life lived as active, responsible owners of one's own transformation. And so I think like this idea of building one's capacity to put into practice those principles that you believe in requires you to be part of a community who is helping you along to do that. And I think part of that process of community is expanding your consciousness. And I think, so just trying to, I think we have a lot of training work in our community, but in our society, but I think really distinguishing what are those spaces of learning, of education that feed our intellectual and spiritual life through deep reflection and action. So where, I think, anyway, just to say that I think all three of our office, in the work that we do in our communities, and then the work that Laura did with We Stories and is now doing in her organizing work and the work of Visionary Organizing Lab, is really committed to process of action, reflection, learning together with people, expanding consciousness, true education.
Can I add one thing also to basically to what PJ was saying, is that it requires being humble, actually being in a humble posture, so that you recognize that I'm not in my full form today, but that I want to learn, I want to do better, and I'm going to make mistakes. But you have to really have that humility. You have to live that humility to be in this process of education. I think that PJ's talking about.
It brings up a question that I have that we didn't get to in the conversation about what does, as we're doing this work, right, and we're building community and engaging community members and, looking for, trying to strive for that benchmark of universal participation, where does, the Baha'i community talks about this idea of building communities that are based on encouragement, right? So how does encouragement, what role does encouragement play in that work of building community, as opposed to, right, what we see oftentimes in community is this kind of derisive criticism that weighs people down with the sense of, well, dog, I can't do anything right. So, so how do we create, communities of resilient using, encouragement and frank and honest consultation, but that aren't based on toxic forms of toxic expressions of criticism. Anybody can hit that if you want. Layla, you want to say something on that?
I was just gonna, oh, go ahead, Layla, sorry.
Go ahead, PJ.
I was just gonna say, I think, yeah, I mean, I think what I'm thinking about is this idea of creating the conditions for certain types of conversations to happen, and the nature of the environments that we create. And so I think encouragement is a really important one, and it connects to what Laura was talking about earlier in terms of courage, and being able to create an environment where people are able to courageously lean into challenging questions, and I think an encouraging environment, one that's built on, you know, some sort of common belief and practice, some sort of love and trust, would enable someone to take those courageous steps that they need to take.
Thank you, PJ. Anybody else? Probably have time for one more comment on this. Layla, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, that there's a way of moving through the world in which you wake up in the morning and your plan for your day is to be spreading love wherever you go, and also to be on the lookout for people whose spirits seem aligned with this kind of social transformation. And even if it's somebody you never met before, how are you connecting to build the critical mass for what will ultimately be a sea change, which will ultimately be, you know, a moment of critical mass when things really change, you know? And so it's really about, you know, moving intentionally with those kinds of things. And I really want to share a quote. I want to thank PJ for actually giving me this quote earlier, but it's from one of the letters of the Universal House of Justice, where they said, "Justice demands universal participation. Thus, while social action may involve the provision of goods and services in some form, its primary concern must be to build capacity within a given population to participate in creating a better world. Social change is not a project that one group of people carries out for the benefit of another." And that really takes me back to the original purpose of this conversation, which was to get us to think about how can everybody be a part of it? Even if we're starting from different starting points, even if we're bringing different dispositions, even if we have different growth trajectories, how can we all become part of a common process? Because ultimately, we're part of one fabric. We're one human race. You know, this is the future, you know, so it's how can we all be about it? So I just, you know, that's what's on my mind.
Well, you know, I think we have time for just one last question, and it involves an issue of politics. One of the participants had a question about politics, and as we're thinking about building these, about universal participation, that invariably means that we're talking about everybody participating, no matter what particular ideology you come from or what background you come from, everybody having a stake in building a more just and equitable future, right? And when we're thinking about politics, which by its very nature, in some sense, is based on entrenched divisions. And I'm wondering how you all think about politics as a hindrance to this work, or do you think of it as a beneficial thing for this work? And anybody can jump in and provide some insight on that, some reflection.
For me, the place I turn to think through that question is in the writings of Martin Luther King. He wrote an essay. It's widely available online. I encourage everybody just to Google the essay, "The Ethical Demands for Integration." And it's in there where King lays out a framework to understand or develop a relationship between the kind of power that is rooted in the political system and the kind and getting people to quote unquote follow laws and the kind of power that is necessary for people to follow the law that is etched on the human heart. And that's the phrase he uses, etched on the human heart.
Speak, brother, speak.
And I think that for King, I think that for me, I take this leadership from King, is that social change is not a political process. It is a spiritual process. And because of the world in which we live, if we're really committed to that spiritual process, we have to engage in politics, because that is the lane of this world where these things get carried through. I think that politics is like a dirty necessity to get to the world in which we follow the laws that are etched on the human heart. And I think for me, what exists is a very, very uncomfortable, incompatible contradiction between the two. And so in my work, in the work of Visionary Organizing Lab, one of the things we think about is how we think, when I said earlier about creating new economies in very simple language, that can look like, growing food in a backyard that can feed a block, so that people don't have to exercise, don't have to spend money at the grocery store. They can, we fully engage in new kind of economic practices that make us more fully human and serve others. I think the question for me is, how do we understand the relationship between that kind of practice or process and a practice of governing that, depending on who's in office, could either smash those practices and make them illegal, or pass laws that support them and sustain them and protect them. And so for me, it's a question, if we're dealing with two different logics, how do we understand the logic of one to the other, especially that allows us to maintain spiritual integrity?
Thank you, brother. That's beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, this has been just wonderful and so rich. And I just really feel like I have grown so much as a result of listening to all of you, and really hearing the different perspectives, the learnings that you have picked up along the way, and just the spirit of resiliency and commitment, man. It's just beautiful. So I just want to thank you for lifting me up, man, and inspiring me, all of you. And I just look forward to all the work that you all are doing, wherever you're going from here. And I think this gathering is a real statement about the interconnectedness of all of us, and that we are all working towards a better, hopefully, and more just society. So thank you all again. Love to you all. I hope to see you all again soon. Laylee, do you have any closing words that you want to share before we bounce out of here?
Just a big thank you to everybody. This has been a wonderful conversation. I know you took it out of your Saturday, and I appreciate you. I know a lot of other people do too. So thank you. We're making the movement together. Thank you.
Just real quick, if it's possible, just for Matt and Laura to share, if anyone wants to follow their work, where they might go. If you're interested in following May and I's work, you just Google U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs and you'll find us. But I don't know, Matt or Laura, if you want to share.
I'm kind of doing my own thing in the new pandemic moment. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Laura R. Horowitz Consulting. And a lot of the work I've done with kids and families and talking to white families about race is at www.westories.org.
You can follow Visionary Organizing Lab on Twitter. It's at visionary_lab. You can find us on Facebook. I don't pretend to know the name of the site, but if you get on Facebook and look up Visionary Organizing Lab, the longest organizational name ever, you will find it. And come January, it's taken us a minute, but come January, most of our programming will be adapted online, so you can take all kinds of workshops with us and so on and so forth, as we survive and love each other into 2021 and create a new world. So you can, and on Facebook, there's a tab to join our mailing list on Facebook, so you can, get emails from us.
Awesome.
If you want to.
Appreciate you, brother
Thanks
Matt. Thank you so much, man. I want to thank again our guests. It's been Laura Horowitz, PJ Andrews, May Lample, and Brother Matt Berkhold. And as always, it is such a pleasure to serve with Laylee. I enjoy these conversations and these dialogues that we're able to participate in. To our guests who join us today, if we didn't get to your questions, we do apologize, but this is, unfortunately, this is a sprint, not a marathon. I mean, we could be here till like 8 o'clock at night, but we'd be some sleepy cats. So if we didn't get to your question, we apologize. Much love to all of you who participated. We appreciate your spirit and your energy. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Love, peace, and chicken grease. Y'all take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.